We're here. I pulled the big SUV into the empty spot between the beach house's legs. The other two parking spaces were taken by a black Mercedes convertible and a bright yellow Prius. Apparently my parents and sister had beat us here. The three-story structure that would be our home for the week sat overlooking the shoreline of Myrtle Beach. Identical houses, though painted a different color, stood on either side of it. "About time," my son Joseph said with a heavy dose of sarcasm. He was 17 and still in the middle of resenting everything his mother and I did for him. "I hope my room looks out on the beach," his sister, Carrie, said. She was 15 and far more enthusiastic about the vacation. "I'm sure your Aunt Lydia has probably already claimed one of those for herself," Melanie, my wife of almost 19 years, said to Carrie. Her crisp Manchester accent put a different emphasis on the words. "Perhaps she'll switch with you. Right, Douglas?" I bit down on my tongue to keep from responding immediately. My kid sister Lydia was, to put it bluntly, a flake. She was 32, recently identifying as gay, despite spending most of her formative years bashing homosexuals, had never held down a steady job, and spent nearly every dime she earned from her art to get a new tattoo or piercing. "I'm sure if you ask her nicely, Pumpkin," I said to Carrie. "Aunt Lydia has a soft spot for you." My wife and daughter went inside the house while Joseph and I unloaded the car. I was on top of the SUV, unhooking the straps holding the luggage carrier when I heard someone say hello to Joseph. Leaning over, I found myself looking down at a rather attractive young lady in a bright green bikini. She had long, copper-colored hair that drifted down over her small shoulders and framed a pretty face wearing dark sunglasses. The bathing suit probably wasn't designed to be indecent, but the developed curves stuffed into it made it almost illegal. From my vantage point, I could see right down into her uplifted cleavage. I glanced over at Joseph, noticing that he was in rapt appreciation of the beauty before him. It took him a second to regain his composure before he tried to speak. Hi," he said, as if he weren't sure how to English properly. "I'm Kara." Kara Beauregard, the redhead said, flashing a small smile up at me and a huge one at Joseph. "We're staying next door." She shrugged. "Thought I'd come over and say hello to my temporary neighbors." My son nodded, then finally started to catch up. "I'm Joe," he said, standing a bit taller now that the initial shock had worn off. "That's my dad, Doug." He pointed up at me. I frowned and looked from my firstborn to the girl. "Mr. Thomas will do." She smiled. "Of course. Mr. Thomas. God, if I was 19 again. Or not married to the love of my life." Joseph might have inherited my large build and good looks, but he was still wet behind the ears when it came to handling a smoking hot female like Kara. "Who's we?" I asked, nodding at the house beside ours. "Right now, it's just me, my little brother Billy, and our grandmother. My mom and dad are flying down tomorrow night. This is our first time to Myrtle Beach." I nodded, then looked at Joseph. "Help me get the rest of the luggage into the house, say hello to your aunt and grandparents, then maybe you can show Kara around the boardwalk before dinner." I felt a bit embarrassed for having to throw my son a bone like that, but I already knew he wasn't going to take the initiative. "Sounds great," Kara said. "Is it okay if Billy comes with us? He's only 10 and can't stay by himself." "What about your grandmother?" She frowned. "She had a stroke last year. She's not able to walk or use one of her arms very well. Billy can behave most of the time, but if something happens, she won't be able to do much." I looked at Joseph. "Why don't you see if Carrie wants to go, too?" "Okay." He looked at Kara. "We'll come over in about 20 minutes. "Sounds good." She flashed him a smile that would have made most red-blooded American men as hard as tempered steel, then sauntered off. We got all the bags into the house, and I made sure Joseph at least spent 5 minutes in greetings with my parents and sister. As expected, Lydia was droning on about the fight for feminism and artistic freedom to our folks, both of whom were doing their best to be supportive of their youngest child. Growing up, I had been instilled with a strong work ethic and the drive to succeed at everything I did. During my senior year of high school, I worked my butt off at a local construction site. By the time I graduated, I knew I wanted to be a general contractor. 30 years later, I owned 3 construction companies and had more governmental contracts than anyone I knew personally. I met Melanie on a trip to London when I was 27. She was a lawyer at a small firm, and her big green eyes and infectious laugh had captured my heart in an instant. We exchanged numbers and spoke regularly on the phone. After 3 more trips to see her in person, I managed to convince her to marry me and move to America. Joseph had been born a year later. "Douglas," Melanie said, placing her hand on my father's arm when Lydia stopped for a breath. "Roger just told me that he and Diane were thinking of taking an extended trip to England this fall. He suggested we join them." My father was a doctor who'd been able to make some pretty good investments over the years. He had retired from his practice at the age of 60, and he and my mother were always jetting off on one adventure or another. "Sounds good," I said to her. "I know it's been a while since we visited your parents. Maybe we can spend a little time with them while we're there." We got settled in, Lydia agreeing to switch rooms with Carrie. Joseph and his sister left with Kara and Billy, who was the complete opposite of his sister. Where she was gorgeous and polite, he was rude and extremely overweight. While they were gone, the 5 of us sat on the deck outside talking. Mother made the mistake of mentioning Lydia's girlfriend, which resulted in my father snorting in a derisive manner and rolling his eyes. Roger Thomas had nothing against homosexuals, he just firmly refused to believe that one of his children could be one. "It's always the new, edgy thing with you, isn't it?" he said to Lydia. "First the tattoos and piercings. Then shaving half your hair off and joining that damned artists' commune in Michigan. Now you're a lesbian feminist fighting against the man. What's next? Transsexual? Are you going to decide that you're really a guy?" "Roger," my mother said sharply. "This really isn't the time." He rolled his eyes again. "It's never the right time, is it? I don't know where we went wrong with her, but it's too bad she couldn't be more like Douglas." Lydia jumped to her feet, knocking over her glass of wine. "Well, I'm sorry I couldn't be more like Mr. Perfect. I guess he managed to get all the greatness and left nothing for me." She put her palm on my father's chest. "Maybe if you'd wanted me to be more like Douglas, perhaps you should have treated me like you did him." Melanie had hopped up as well, trying to keep the spilled alcohol from running off the table. She hated the way my family could go from being perfectly fine to shouting at each other. Particularly my father and sister. "Look," I said, standing up. "We all came here for a vacation away from the stress of our normal lives. How about we just try to put ourselves in each other's shoes for once?" I shook my head as I looked at my father and sister. "Every time we get together, you two." A wave of dizziness splashed over me as the world around pitched violently to the right. I floundered my arms for balance, but darkness overcame me before I hit the deck. I felt someone lightly shaking my shoulder, tugging me back to consciousness. "Are you okay? Can you hear me? Joseph?" Joseph was trying to bring me around? How long had I been passed out? I slowly peeled my eyes open to see my son looming over me. Vertigo was taking its time releasing my brain, but I had still returned to awareness enough that I could hear the sounds of screams coming from all around me. I fought against the nausea and slowly sat up, looking around. The first thing I noticed was that I wasn't on the deck of the beach house. Instead, I was several blocks away, sitting on the soft sand next to the sidewalk that ran along the strip. Several cars had crashed into buildings and light posts, and everyone around seemed to be either screaming, staring around blankly, or grabbing themselves with shocked expressions. Joseph placed his hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked again. I nodded, turning away from the pandemonium to look at him. I think so." Only the voice that came out of my mouth was definitely not mine. "What the hell? Kara, what's wrong?" "Kara?" I looked down to see what seemed to be a huge amount of cleavage wrapped in a green bikini looking back at me. Just beyond my disturbingly large bust were a pair of shapely legs I had been admiring only a few hours earlier. The dainty toes poking out of the sandals on my feet were painted a light pink shade. "Oh shit," I said, wincing again at the soft, feminine voice. "This is way too much." Joseph nodded, glancing around at the commotion. I noticed his hand remained firmly planted on my shoulder, almost possessively. Then he looked behind me. "Carrie and Billy are waking up." I shrugged his hand off my shoulder and turned around. My daughter and Kara's brother were sitting up, rubbing at their heads and blinking with confusion. They looked down at themselves for a few moments, Billy poking at his bulging gut. Carrie's hands cupped her smallish breasts beneath the tank top, her head shaking back and forth. Then her eyes locked onto mine and she jumped to her feet. "You!" she screamed, pointing at me. "Give me back my body!" Joseph got to his feet, moving between me and his sister. Or what he thought was his sister. "Carrie," he said. "Calm down." "I'm not Carrie, jerk," she shouted. "I'm Kara." I climbed to my feet, trying not to be too put off by the way the body I was in wanted to move. There weren't enough muscles in places I was used to, and far too much jiggling in others. Although, I did have to admit that, other than a slight residual headache, I felt better than I've felt in years. Joseph turned and looked at me, then to the street. Several people were mimicking Carrie, or Kara as it were, accosting others and demanding they give back their bodies. His mouth dropped open slightly and, after a few seconds, looked at the body of his little sister. "You're Kara?" His gaze went back to me. "Then who are you?" I sighed, bringing my arms up to cross them over my chest to provide some type of modesty. I wasn't a fan of the way he kept trying to look at the barely covered mounds. "I'm Dad," I said. "Douglas." His eyes nearly widened enough to fall out of their sockets. "Dad," he said in a voice laden with shock and dismay. "Oh, Douglas," the boy behind Carrie/Kara said in a familiar British accent. "What happened to us?" All three of us turned to look at him. Carrie/Kara knelt down beside him. "You're not Billy, are you?" The chubby boy shook his head, then pointed at me. "I'm his wife, her wife." She stomped her foot, a trait she had when something was vexing her. "Douglas' wife, Joseph's mum." "We need to get back to the house," I said, choosing to look at my son rather than the prepubescent boy that talked like my wife or the girl in the driver's seat of my daughter's body. "It looks like whatever happened didn't just happen to us. We need to find out if it was just the Strip, the whole city, or worse." The walk back to the beach house took longer than I expected. In addition to the people running around in various stages of panic, I was fighting the strange, unfamiliar body. A few blocks into the journey, Kara closed the distance to walk beside me. "I hope this is only temporary," she said in a low voice. "But until we get it fixed, can I give you some advice? You've got hips, boobs, and an ass now. Just let them do the work and it will be much better." She shrugged. "Believe me, when everything grew in all at once, it took me a while to move normally, too." "Thanks," I said, biting my tongue to say something negative. Right now, I had to hope that the strange incident was not only isolated, but being investigated by the powers that be. The four of us climbed the stairs to the door of the house and went inside. The place was eerily silent, except for the unnerving sound of a droning tone coming from the living room. I rushed through the doorway to see myself, my parents, Melanie, and Lydia all huddled together on the sofa, staring at the television. The screen had an image that read "Emergency Broadcast. Please stand by." Those 5 words sent a bucket of ice water swirling through my veins. This was obviously much bigger than Myrtle Beach. The quintet on the sofa turned to look at us as we came into the room. Melanie hopped to her feet and grabbed Carrie/Kara. "Who are you?" she asked, leaning down to peer into the young girl's eyes. "That's my body." Oh God, I thought. Carrie's in her mother. "I'm Kara," Carrie's mouth replied. When Melanie's eyes widened, my daughter's head nodded at me and the boy holding my hand. "Your dad got mine, and your mom is in Billy's." The stares being directed at me made my face grow hot. I released the hand in mine and covered my chest again. "Did you all switch, too?" I asked. Because Joseph apparently didn't. My head nodded. I'm in my son's body. Eyes I'd seen only in pictures and reflections looked at the four of us before focusing on me. I'm sorry, Douglas. Tears began to spill out down my cheeks. I almost started crying myself. It's okay, Mom. Then I looked at the rest of them. Lydia looked like she was about to throw up. But the way she was sitting, with her leg crossed over her knee and a slight lean to her side, I had a good idea who was riding around in my sister's skull. Dad? The head gleaming with over a dozen shiny bits of metal nodded once. Unfortunately, it would seem that your sister and I have traded places. He shook his head. I'm not going to try to attempt to explain how this could have possibly happened. However, despite the randomness that the switches seem to have occurred, I can only guess we swapped because we were touching when it happened. I nodded, then turned to my mother. Or at least, the person who looked like my mother. Constance, she said, giving the barest hint of a smile. Constance Beauregard. Grandma? Carrie/Kara said before rushing over to drop to her knees before the woman who'd birthed me. Grandma, is it really you? My mother's head nodded. Yes, Kara. It's me. Her eyes came up to look at the boy standing there looking completely lost. Billy? The teen shook her head. That's the wife of the man who got my body. Melanie Thomas. Then she jumped to her feet, whipping her head around. Wait. Then where is Billy? Everyone is here, right? The woman next to her put her hand on the girl's arm. Not everyone, dear. She frowned. I'm not here. I remained behind with my wife, Lydia, my father, my mother, and Joseph while Kara/Carrie and her grandmother went next door. They returned a few minutes later with wet eyes and trembling bodies. He's dead, Kara's grandmother said. Perhaps the shock of what happened caused my body to have another stroke. She wiped away the streams of tears running down her cheeks. I hope it was painless. Just then, the television came to life. The emergency broadcast screen was replaced by an uncomfortable-looking man who might be in his late 50s. However, the teletype at the bottom of the screen read Anita Johansson. I recognized the name from hearing some of my guys talk during break time. Apparently, she was this super hot television anchor who'd parlayed a modeling career into a successful stab at journalism. Now, she looked like the kind of guy who spent his days at a dive bar, drinking scotch straight. Good afternoon, the former beauty pageant winner said in a gruff, scratchy voice. By now, I'm sure everyone in America has discovered that something completely unprecedented has occurred. The authorities are referring to it as the Great Shift. Right now, details are sketchy, but it is assumed that nearly 93% of the world's population has switched bodies with someone. I looked over at Joseph. Talk about winning the lottery. Looks like my son was one of the lucky 7%. Right now, martial law has been declared in almost every country. Elected leaders are no longer in their proper bodies, and until such time as the true identities of the people who are supposed to be in charge can be assessed, the highest-ranking official not affected by this great shift will maintain order. She sighed and scratched at the heavy stubble under her chin and down her neck. Folks, this is a nightmare for everyone. If you're one of the ones who are still themselves, please help assist the affected around you. If you are in a body that's not yours, please try to find the rightful owner so proper identification can be made. We can get this sorted out. If we all remain calm and work together. The screen went back to the EBS placeholder. However, a new script had been added at the bottom reading. Local identification centers will be operational within 24 hours. Please remain calm and indoors until the location and times of the centers is announced. Kara's grandmother tried to call for an ambulance to pick up her dead body, but all the circuits were busy. We decided as a group to remain in the one house together, just in case something new was reported. Dinner was hot dogs and hamburgers cooked on the grill and washed down with diet soda. No one really had much of an appetite. Except for my wife. Apparently, Billy's body was used to eating mass quantities and didn't give a damn who was currently living in it. She ate a hamburger and 3 hot dogs before bursting into tears and running out of the room. Sleeping arrangements were also a bit of a contention. I wanted to sleep in the same bed as Melanie, but Kara didn't want her body in bed with her brother. Carrie didn't mind that the older girl was planning on spending the night with her body beside my mother's. Joseph merely shook his head and said that he planned on crashing on the living room floor, offering his own bed to whomever wanted it. In the end, Kara and her grandmother slept in the room that was supposed to be Joseph's. My father took Lydia's room, claiming that since her stuff was in there, it just made sense. Lydia agreed and took my parents' room. My mother was a bit upset that her husband wanted to sleep alone, but my wife convinced her it was probably because the thought of the bodies of his adult children sharing a bed was too weird for him to process. She ended up in Carrie's room. The rest of us grabbed blankets and pillows to make a huge pile on the living room floor. Kara had been nice enough to go back to her house to grab some clothing for me and my wife. She didn't want her grandmother to have to deal with seeing her own lifeless body again. I went into one of the bathrooms when I could finally hold off no longer. Luckily, I'd been married long enough to have watched my wife pee nearly 1,000 times, so I knew what to do. However, the knowledge wasn't enough to counter the oddness of feeling wet between my legs and the rough sensation of paper being dragged across my crotch. When I was done, I quickly slipped into the clothes Kara had provided. The panties and yoga pants went on without issue, and I deliberately didn't look at myself as I removed the bikini top and slipped into the sports bra and t-shirt. 6 hours previously, I might have been tempted to sneak as many looks as I could at the nubile teenaged body of the girl next door. Now, I felt like an even bigger pervert since I was in it. Melanie was dressed in a pair of baggy nylon shorts and a Superman tee that almost didn't cover her big belly. The look she gave me when I emerged from the bathroom was one part sadness and one part jealousy. I'm sure she was wondering, at least on some level, why she didn't get the redhead's body. Joseph's eyes started to look me over as I walked toward the couch. Then he shuddered and turned his gaze elsewhere. I wanted to laugh. After all that had transpired since the great shift, he was still unable to remember that the hot girl before him was really his dad. Melanie had helped Carrie with getting ready for bed while I was trying not to ogle myself. Her long blonde hair was much thicker than Carrie's had been and required a great deal of brushing to avoid tangles. The 4 of us, 3 still feeling a bit out of place, gathered together on the floor and sat in silence, occasionally glancing over at the television. Before long, I noticed Melanie's eyes getting heavy and she rolled over onto her side, beginning to snore like the piglet she now resembled. Carrie lasted a few minutes longer, but eventually she, too, drifted off to dreamland. "Dad?" Joseph said quietly once his mom and sister were asleep. "What if they can't fix this?" I didn't answer immediately. The same question had been nagging at me since Anita's news report. I had the sneaking suspicion that our new situation was going to be permanent. Or, if not permanent, a long time in repairing. "I guess we'll find a way to adapt, son." It felt weird to hear the sultry voice in my throat call him son. I tried to smile. The important part is that we are all together and we know where and who we all are. I have a feeling that there are a lot of people in bodies they don't know. With strangers who are in the same boat. He nodded and then went back to staring silently at the television. Having nothing more to say, I rolled over onto my side, aware of how the motion made my breasts feel. Would it be the end of the world if I was stuck in this body for the rest of my life? I pondered the pros and cons of suddenly being young again, albeit a female this time. I didn't get far in my musings before sleep claimed me. The next morning, I was awakened by someone stepping on my leg. "Ow!" I yelped, sitting upright and pushing the mess of red hair out of my face. "Sorry," Melanie said as she sat down next to me. "I still can't seem to get the gist of this, body." I nodded and put my arm around her, trying to ignore the way she stiffened at my touch. Did she recoil because of who she was now? Or because of who I was? Within a few minutes later, the television screen jumped back to the national news channel from the previous day. The older man Anita Johansson had shifted into reappeared. However, the scruffy beard was shaved smooth and his dirty, thinning hair had been washed, conditioned, and styled with Hollywood precision. The stained clothing replaced with a perfectly fitting gray suit. "Good morning, America. We apologize for taking so long to come back on the air. As I'm sure you can imagine, the scene here in the studio, as well as the country, has been a bit chaotic." She flashed a practiced smile, and I noticed someone had done a hell of a whitening job on the slightly crooked teeth. "In a few minutes, the locations of your local identification center will flow across the bottom of your screen. Please bring whatever documentation or information you have that can corroborate your former identity. If possible, please try to have the person who you shifted with accompany you. The National Guard has been mobilized to help process identities and maintain order. We will continue to bring you updates as they become available." We waited as the image went to a blue screen with the silhouette of South Carolina superimposed upon it. A few minutes later, cities and address started scrolling from the bottom to the top. "The pavilion," I said when the name appeared. "That's just down the street. We can walk it." We roused the rest of the house to let them know the latest news. Kara and her grandmother wanted to go immediately, but my mother urged them to slow down. "We should probably eat something and get properly dressed before going down there. There's bound to be quite a long line and I, for one, don't want to be standing in it hungry and in my pajamas." Then the door at the end of the hallway slammed open and my father appeared, followed by Lydia. He marched away from her as fast as the shorter legs would carry him, but my sister wasn't about to let him get away. Her face, which needed shaving, was bright red with fury. "What the hell, Dad? You can't just make changes because you want to. That's still my body, you know." We all turned to look at the commotion. My father entered the kitchen and grabbed a mug from the counter. He filled it to the top with coffee before turning around. Sometime between retiring for the night and getting up this morning, he had removed every bit of metal from his face. The eyebrow bars, the nose ring, the double lip piercings, and every hoop in his ears was gone. Lydia marched over and towered above him. "What do you think you were doing?" He sighed and put the mug down on the counter before getting up into his daughter's face. "I took all that disgusting crap out. At least, the pieces I could remove on my own." He shook his head. "I mean, Jesus Christ, Lydia. You had your clit and labia pierced, too?" Carrie snickered, but a stern look from her grandfather silenced her quickly. He gestured at the ornate designs running up and down his slender, hairless arms. "I probably will just have to learn to live with this, but every one of those damn piercings is getting removed as soon as possible." "You can't do that," she whined. Which was eerie, coming from the mouth of the man who had always seemed like an unshakable force for most of my life. "That's my body you're screwing with." "Not anymore," he said, taking another sip of the Java. "You had probably better get used to the new you. You're going to be in there for a while. You don't think they'll find a way to shift us back?" Constance asked from her seat at the dining table. My father shook her head. "Very doubtful. First of all, they might not know how it happened. Even if they do, they might not know how to reverse it." He frowned, making Lydia's face look like it was about to start crying. "Plus, I think it's too late to put everyone back where they belong. If it has a proximity feature, as I suspect, then people who shifted because they were near to each other are probably now far apart." He paused, looking away from his wife's former face. "Some of the shifts are dead." The group's mood, uplifted by the earlier announcement from the television, took a nosedive. We agreed to leave for the pavilion in approximately 2 hours, in order to give everyone time to eat, get dressed, and write down all their personal information for the one who'd ended up in their body. I was out on the deck, watching the tide come in on the mostly deserted beach. Given the circumstances of the past 24 hours, I wasn't surprised to see that splashing in the surf or lounging in the sun had lost their appeal for now. "Hey," Kara said as she came through the door. "Can we, go for a walk?" I looked at her for a moment. She was wearing a dark blue tank top and khaki shorts I remembered Carrie buying specifically for this trip. I was still in the yoga pants and tee I'd slept in. Kara had informed me earlier that, other than similar items to sleep in, she had only packed skirts, dresses, and bathing suits. Sure, I said slowly as I stood up. Lead the way. We went down the steps to the edge of the dunes, then walked around until we were under the carport of the house next door. When we stopped walking, I gave her a dubious look. This is all very secretive, I said. I just needed to talk to someone who isn't losing their mind over the shift. Oh, and you think that would be me? She nodded. Yeah. I mean, other than the obvious issues with being jammed into a body that's not yours, you've managed to remain calm and rational. Everyone else, they're having a harder time? She nodded again. Your dad and sister are about to kill each other. Your mom hasn't really said a lot since we all identified ourselves. Carrie has been super sweet with trying to help me adjust to her body, but she's freaking out over suddenly being old and her mom. Melanie's not that old, I protested. She's only 45. Yeah? And now your 15-year-old daughter has to deal with losing 30 years. I mean, at least I only got 5 years younger. That's a manageable difference. Wait, I said. You're 20? She shook her head. No, Douglas. You're 20. Grandma seems to be okay. I mean, she's sad that Billy died, but also happy to be in a body 10 years younger that works properly and is in good health. She looked into my eyes for a moment before continuing. The biggest issue is your wife. As you said, she was only 45. And she looked very good for a woman her age with kids. Now she's your little brother. I don't think she's coping. Not really. I think she's just going along. When your father stated that he figured we were stuck, I thought she was going to throw up. I'm sure she'll come around soon, I said. Though something in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. I mean, she's 10 again. Once she's through puberty and loses the baby fat, I think she'll be okay. It's not baby fat, Douglas. Billy has had a glandular problem. He's been big all his life, no matter what type of diet our folks had him on. When he was diagnosed last year, they just decided to let him be happy. You know, since he was going to be fat anyway. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I loved my wife dearly, even in her new body. However, I also knew she could be very vain. If she found out that she was destined to grow up to be an overweight man, regardless of how much she exercised or watched what she ate, she was not going to take it well. I sighed. It was weird hearing such logical observations coming out of the mouth of my teenaged daughter. The deepest thing I could recall Carrie saying recently was an argument on why one particular actor was better than another in a particular role. You've raised some good points. I guess we'll have to see how things go as time progresses. Oh, and I wanted to give you these. I just figured you'd prefer if I did it privately. She reached into the back pocket of her shorts and handed me a small, plastic case. They're birth control pills. I laughed and handed them back. That's okay, Kara. I don't plan on having sex in your body. At least not any time in the foreseeable future. She shook her head, refusing to accept the case. I don't plan on you having sex in my body either, Douglas. However, unless the shift changed something in my cycle, you are less than a week from your period. The pills help with the cramping, which, I'm afraid to say, is really painful. I felt the color drain out of my face. I'd been so smug about knowing how to wipe after peeing and figuring out how to put on a bra, I hadn't given any thought to the fact that I was in the body of a fertile young woman. Periods and their related problems had been the last thing on my mind. What about protection? She smirked. It was something I'd never seen Carrie do, and it made her youthful face light up with amusement. Since I'm sure you're not talking about a condom or diaphragm, I'm going to assure you that I always travel prepared for things to start early. There are pads, liners, and tampons upstairs. I nodded, dreading having to get Melanie teach me how everything was supposed to work. Thanks, I said. We should probably head back so we can go get ourselves straightened out. At least, legally. We returned along the same path we'd used before. However, when we emerged from between the hedges separating the 2 yards, I saw Melanie standing on the deck above. Her eyes stared at us as something unhappy drifted across her chubby cheeks. Then she turned around and went back inside. The line to get processed was almost 2 blocks long, though it moved quicker than I would have expected. Our group didn't talk much as we waited, though Melanie complained more than once about being way too hot. Billy's body had more insulation than she was used to. After standing in the hot, summer sun for nearly an hour, it was our turn to go inside the gigantic tent set up in the parking lot of the closed amusement park. We were led to a table staffed by a young woman in her late 20s with dark brown hair tucked under a military cap. She wore fatigue pants and a gray t-shirt with the National Guard logo on the left chest. A computer monitor and keyboard were on the table before her. Next, she called out. Kara and I were at the front of our group, so we went first. Full name, current residence, and social security number if you know it. Douglas Matthew Thomas, I said. Then I gave her my current address and my social. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. She turned the monitor so I could see the screen. There, in full color, was the same picture on my driver's license. That you? She asked. I nodded. Yeah. At least, it was. I tried to smile at my own gallows humor. She chuckled softly. I get you. Really. This great shift thing has been hell on everyone. Her fingers resumed dancing on the keyboard. Do you know who you are now? Kara stepped forward to stand beside me. Kara Marie Beauregard. I don't recall my social security number though. Current residence and date of birth, then? Kara provided the additional information and the image from her driver's license appeared next to mine. The soldier studied the dates and facts for a moment before typing again. 28 years, she said, cutting her eyes at me for a second before looking at the screen again. It's like having to do your whole life over. I arched a brow. Did you end up in someone younger than you were? I asked. She smirked and nodded. Yeah. I switched with that one over there. She lifted one hand and pointed at another processing table. The female soldier sitting behind it, helping process my parents, was the spitting image of the one helping us. For a second, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Then Kara caught on first. Twins, she said, grinning. The soldier nodded, continuing her task. Yeah. I used to be older by 5 minutes. Now she's acting like she's the more mature one now. How did you know you shifted? I asked. I mean, you guys look exactly the same. The unaffected didn't pass out. Only the ones who shifted did. Plus, there's this. She stopped typing to lift the bottom of her tee. A scar ran along her abdomen near the top of her government-issue pants. She had an appendectomy when we were 11. As I pondered the notion that I could have swapped with Lydia instead of Kara, the soldier asked for the information on the body Kara had shifted into. I gave her Carrie's name and social. The screen changed, with Kara's picture moving to where mine had been and Carrie's high school photo appearing in its place. A few moments later, the woman stabbed her finger on one last button. Done, she said. Beside her, a printer began to shake and hum. The piece of paper that slid out onto the tray had a picture of the old me and an image of my new appearance. There was a barcode inked across the bottom. Okay, in about 5 weeks or so, you'll get a new ID card in the mail at your residence on file. It will look like a smaller version of that. Her tone turned slightly serious. That card will be the only accepted legal form of identification for you. Your old driver's license, or hers, is now invalid. If you lose your ID card, you'll have to go through processing again. Got it? We both nodded. She then turned and handed Kara her new identity. Good luck, she said. Hey, one question? The soldier arched a brow. Yeah? What about the government? Did everyone shift? She glanced around, then lowered her voice. I haven't heard anything official. But some of the others said they heard the president is missing. Apparently, some Chinese schoolgirl on a tour of the White House landed in his body. Took them a while to find a translator. They also said the Veep was across town with his mistress when it happened. I guess he's laying low for now so he doesn't have to reveal he was banging some washed-up porn star on the sly. I sighed. If it was a pain for the average person to get their new identities sorted out, how much worse could it be for the people in power? The last thing the world needed was some lunatic with nuclear launch codes. Back at the beach house, I took a long shower to wash off the sweat and grime. At first, I was hesitant to touch the more private parts of Kara's body. Then I remembered what my father had said and figured that accepting that there was nothing wrong with touching myself would help speed up the acclimation process. However, I kept my soaping antics completely PG and worked on simply getting clean. When I emerged from the bathroom, I found Melanie sitting on the edge of the bed. She pointed at a bag in a nearby chair. The top of the satchel was open. "Your little girlfriend brought you some more clothes," she said with a bit of spite. Then she held up a pair of black lace thong panties. "Are you going to model these for her later?" I stomped over and snatched the undergarments from her meaty little fist. "What the hell is wrong with you, Mels? Are you seriously getting jealous? Of Kara?" She crossed her arms over her chest, revealing the little man boobs beneath her shirt. "I've noticed you two becoming rather chummy today." She shook her head. "Is it because she looks like Carrie now? Are you lusting after your own daughter? You pervert." My hand came up all on its own and struck her across one of her flabby jaws. The sound was a gunshot in the room. Her eyes widened and her hand flew up to cradle the glowing red spot on her cheek. "I'm sorry," I said, sitting down on the bed. "I shouldn't have done that." She glared at me, still holding her face. "I'm a fish out of water here, Melanie. Just like you. Like the rest of us. Even Joseph. He might not have been directly affected, but he's dealing with the aftermath of having his entire family in completely different bodies." I sighed. Kara lost her brother, and probably her parents. Their plane would have been airborne when the shift happened. I think her trying to help me adjust to being her is her way of coping with it all. Slowly, my wife lowered her hand. The imprint of where I'd stuck her was definitely visible on her pasty white face. "You know what I see, Douglas? I see you enjoying your time with her while I have to be stuck in this ugly, disgusting blob of a boy." She hiccuped, tears beginning to run down her face. "I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life in this person. I remember how rough puberty was on Joseph, and I'm not looking forward to going through that again from this side of it. Plus, how are we going to work?" I gave her a strange look. "I still own my companies. Once things settle, people will start building again. Until then, we have enough saved to last a few years. You might be in the body of a little boy, but you still know how to practice law, right?" She sighed. "No, Douglas. How are we going to work? You and me? It will be years before I'm old enough to do anything sexual. And even then, I'm not gay. Or, I guess I am, since I'm apparently still attracted to men." I thought about how I'd seen her little boy eyes staring at my mother during breakfast. It had been the same way she looked at me when she wanted us to lock ourselves in the bedroom for the day. As for me, I hadn't given any consideration about my possible sexual orientation. I mean, I still found Melanie's body attractive, but the moment I remembered it was my daughter in it, any desire wilted like a raisin in the sun. "I don't know, Mels. I just don't know." I reached out for her, but she slipped off the bed and away from my touch. "I don't either," she said, stopping at the door. "I guess we'll have to decide when we get home." Melanie avoided me after that. In fact, most of us began to hang around with only one or two of the others. Kara and I spent a lot of time together. Sometimes Carrie or Joseph joined us. My parents and Kara's grandmother formed a little trio that sat around talking about who knew what. Once or twice, I saw my mother touch Lydia on the leg with my hand. A simple, innocent gesture. For now. The thought of my parents having sex in my and Lydia's bodies made me nauseated. Of course, the way Constance was behaving as well turned the pairing into a threesome. Lydia spent a lot of time by herself, which was probably a good thing. I had discovered she had snuck off one evening to a tattoo parlor on the strip that had reopened. She came back with 3 new inked artworks on her arms. At first, my father had threatened to beat her for doing it. Then she reminded him that it was he who claimed we were never getting our old bodies back. Since his body was now hers, she would do with it what she pleased. True to her prediction, Kat's period arrived 6 days after the shift. I awoke that morning feeling as if someone had beat me repeatedly across the abdomen and back. Thankfully, the constant contractions killed any appetite I might have had since there was no way I could get out of bed, much less walk across the house. Kat brought me some chicken broth that evening, and some Myrtle. Afterwards, she rubbed my back for more than an hour to ease the worst of the cramps. "The first day is always the worst," she said. "If you don't take the pills, the first day lasts more than one." I found her concern and care for my condition sweet and comforting. However, it only served to further drive a wedge between me and Melanie. When my attempts to reassure her that there was nothing romantic between Kara and I went nowhere, I decided that she could just get over it or die mad. The cellular network came back online 4 days after the shift. Of course, many people had jumped into a body that didn't have access to their phone. A lot more, however, swapped with someone in their house or neighborhood. I called my company's team leaders, checking to see how they'd weathered the event. 3 of them had shifted with their wives, one with his 11-year-old daughter, and one with his son's fiancée. 2 of the calls were answered by strangers who had no idea where their body's original owners had ended up. Kara was able, after a really long day, to get through to someone at the airline who had kept their own body. They confirmed, after triple-checking their logs, that her parents' plane had landed safely after the shift. However, when the passengers had been put through the identification process, her folks' names had not come up. "It's possible they were infantilized," the lady on the phone said. "Infantilized?" Kara asked. She had the phone on speaker mode so we could both hear the call. "Yes. It seems that adults who shifted into children under 2 years of age cannot remember anything about who they were. One of the doctors here thinks the underdeveloped brain of someone that young cannot hold a lifetime of memories." The lady sounded extremely apologetic. "I'm afraid that there were about a dozen infants on that flight, so the likelihood of your parents shifting into one of them is pretty good." Kara only cried for a few minutes. She'd already resigned herself that her parents were already dead. Now that they might be alive, even if they were babies, eased some of that pain. "I guess I really am on my own now," she said as she wiped her cheeks. 15 days after the Great Shift, our mismatched tribe decided it was time to abandon the beach house. Not so much because the owners wanted us out, but because we had reached a point where we needed to get away from each other. My parents decided to return home to Michigan. Despite being a tattooed, 30-year-old woman, my father wanted to start practicing medicine again. Since his license had never been revoked, and the identity card would prove who he really was, he would be able to pick up as if he'd never stopped. My mother said that she was considering taking up golf, now that she had a more athletic body. Not surprisingly, Constance decided to go with them. Lydia left in the middle of the night. The next morning, we found a note that read, "Hate you all. Never want to see you again." Joseph, Melanie, Carrie, and I were heading back to Northern Virginia. I invited Kara to come with us, despite knowing that Melanie would be dead set against it. "Thanks for the offer, Douglas," she said. "But I think I'm going to strike out on my own for a while. I've pretty much been taking care of Billy and Grandma for the past 2 years, maybe it's time for me to finally go to college." "That's understandable," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel on my face. "Still, you've got the address. Stop by anytime. You're always welcome." She cut her eyes over to the rear of the house. Melanie sat in one of the lounge chairs, looking at the ocean. Joseph and Carrie were inside getting the last of our things ready to be loaded into the car. "Somehow, I doubt that," she said. "You are. I know Carrie would be happy to have you visit as much as you wanted. Probably Joseph, too." "What about you?" she asked. I stared down at her for a few minutes, then nodded. "Me, too. She laughed and pulled her sunglasses down over her eyes. After another couple of seconds, she rose up on her tiptoes and placed a kiss on my mouth. Then she dropped back down and grinned. Maybe I'll look you up in 3 years. Don't wait that long, I said. Then it did a little pose. After all, have you seen how hot I am? I have, girl. I really have. She started walking backward toward the carport of the other house. Bye, Kara. Bye. I took one last look around the area. The normal sounds of the beach had finally started to return and life was beginning to get back to normal. Or as normal as they could be after the great shift.